I will hand over to Ibrahim to try and tease out the thoughts from the industry and get some of the pressure points and the burning issues that they see on the ground. Over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you, except that I'm not going to be the teaser outer. That's what we got these colleagues and friends here for. So let's start off with Wandile Sitlobo from the Agricultural Business Chamber. Wandile, it's emotive. There's moral dimensions, there's dimensions of social justice, but there are also prudent dimensions of reality of, I mean, some people's fears around property rights, some of it may be misplaced. But, you know, where do we go with this land debate? Is there an upside to unlock, rather?
I thought you were going to start by gift. That's why I picked this chair, so I could be the last one.
No, we like the extreme left to start.
The extreme left. Look, I think for me, just in the next few minutes on teasing up on how I see the things, I would make my opening remarks in about 3 points. To say, firstly, on an obvious one that most South Africans that are in the audience might know, to say what is the lay of the land, what is actually happening, take from 1994 up until to today, to say how much has really been transferred. And if there is some, what were the policies that were really driving that? Were there success or failures, and what can we learn from there? And also then to say, out of that outcome, what has been the political class's response, either ANC or EFF, and also what do I think, at least from where I sit also on the advisory panel side to the presidency, the policy approach maybe going forward could potentially be. And on starting off on the lay of the land, look, the first thing that we can all acknowledge as sitting on here is that in South Africa, we don't really have good data on how much on the land has been transferred. You look at the state, for example, they put up numbers where they say only about 9% of the land from 1994 up until to today has actually been transferred. But if you look on the academic side, which, for example, the work that I did with the guys like Johan Kirsten, the head of the BER at Stellenbosch University, and the other guys, we have our numbers at about 21%. And obviously, all of us differ one way or another in terms of the methodologies of what has been happening. But then if one were to go with our figures to say land reform has actually progressed, is about 21% that has been bought by the government. The next question then that comes up is to say, if that's the case, but why has the urgency or the issues on a social side still coming up? If we really progress on a land reform, why are people not feeling satisfied? Because the target, as we see on the NDP and also on the ANC's document, was about 30%, but obviously the years have been moving from the early 90s to 2014 and all of that, but the NDP now is putting that by 2030. And for me, at least in my judgment, I think that what underpins that is on the policy side to say, forget the numbers for a minute, but what has actually been happening then with that land that the state has actually bought from 1994 up until to today. I think 1994 heading on into 2006 was the better way at which we approached the whole discussion about land reform. And I make that point in terms of transferring the property rights and the land to whoever actually got to benefit on that process, particularly on redistribution, take away restitution and tenure for a minute. And during that particular period, the state was giving beneficiaries the land up until 2006, where they introduced what they called the proactive land acquisition strategy, which basically felt that some of the land that they were buying and giving it to beneficiaries was in any way being sold back to the original owners or any other white guy who wanted to get on into farming. And by virtue of that, your expenditure towards land reform was continuing, but the profile of the change of land ownership were not really changing much. And then they introduced the proactive land acquisition strategy. And I mean, nicely, we have Gift here. He will speak from the producer's perspective on how he felt about all of these policies. But as an outsider or sitting on the policy side, I feel that what that policy did was to say, okay, now the state will own all of the land that it buys from 2006 up until to today, but the beneficiaries will have those leases. Theoretically, we were thinking that there will be some support system which will follow through into that and ensuring that there will be some productive use of that particular, of those pieces of land. But nothing really followed rigorously to ensure that there was productive use of those farms, which is why I think then it delved down to the frustrations that when we say 21% of the land has been transferred, but the people's living standards or productivity of the land has actually not been there. And one way or another, you jump on Google now, you say land reform farms in South Africa. They will, land reform failing farms in South Africa. You get hundreds of hits. And people always say it has to do with the skills of the new black farmers that are farming. But I don't think that's where the problem is at. I think the problem is largely on saying those pieces of land that has been given to people as leases, were they given title deeds, were they able to access capital, was there follow-through support, which was not there in most cases. And that has led partially to the failures of the land reform. Now you have that frustration that is in the system. And you have the political class then that came on to say, okay, land reform coming up, the ANC, say 2007 conference, where they said ditch the market principles of a willing buyer, willing seller, and go for expropriation with just and equitable compensation. Then, up until fast forward, we led into 2007, where this discussion intensified. And as it intensified, when people looked at themselves in the living standards, they were not seeing any changes, regardless of what the numbers were saying. So one way or another, I think that not transferring title deeds was one of the story, but also the pace of land reform on its own in South Africa was not at a desired pace. It might be the land pricing that we saw, the increase in the land prices and all sorts of things adding into that. But the institutional approach across the government departments also was part of the problem. Nonetheless, you leave that aside, and then you say, what was the policy response then on the side of the politicians, which is where then we ended up with the expropriation side without compensation, where they said land reform is slow. We are not really seeing much of a progress. Maybe the better part is to implement this policy so that we can acquire more land and redistribute it to people. But we really need lead to a productive asset, if you good productivity of that land, if we take that approach where it would contribute to growth and everything else that we want. That's part of the question. But the one point also I would like to add, I see I still have a bit of time, is on the issue now of saying, what did the political class actually say on their statements? Because I think there's also been a bit of a confusion. You had the EFF, which came up and saying nationalize the republic so that the government owns the lands and all of that stuff. But you had the ANC, which said you can expropriate without compensation on certain pockets of land, underutilized land in debt and all of that. And you are going to read this if you were to go to their website and you pull up their 54th annual report and you check page 31. But it's a pity you can't, because their website is down. They didn't pay for it. But if you were to go, you are going to see this work in there. But there's a difference between what the ANC said as well as what the EFF said. And I think those views have been conflated, partially also by ANC people. President Zuma, December, came up on Twitter to explain what he deemed as an approach on land reform. But he actually explained the EFF position, not exactly what is written on the ANC policy position. And now that's the confusion also that has been caused on a political side. But now, forget all of this. What would be the policy approach that we think will be happening going forward? I think that on a policy approach side, the focus in terms of the expropriation without compensation will largely be on those particular pieces of land that I highlighted, underutilized, held in speculation, but there will be a definition at which we have given to those pockets of land. There might not be a widespread expropriation as what the discussion broadly outside is largely on, and I think that the politicians, at least the presidency side, is aware of any of the unintended consequences going forward. But one way also, the other thing that will be useful is on the institutions that will be applying whatever policies that will be coming up from the presidency, because that's one of the pockets at which we have highlighted as being lacking going forward. But I will add more at some of those things as the discussion goes forward. Let me stop there on the remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Andile. Dr. Langelihle Simela, who's an animal scientist, but also interested in agribusiness transformation. Is what Wandile is saying appropriate? Is there value to unlock? Is it possible? Is there some prudence to this debate, or is it just wild rhetoric?
There is great prudence in this debate. I think we sit with a historic problem that needs to be resolved, and I'm going to speak about it from an ABSA perspective, we say one of our ways of doing business is that we must promote intergenerational sustainability and have innovative solutions to societal problems. So the land reform is one of the societal problems that we sit with. And we can't sit with and say, as banks, we require collateral, we require this, and therefore we will not be part of the debate. You only sit on a time bomb if you do that. You need to come up with the solution. So we've actively participated in the discussion on land reform and provided our comments on it. And some of the things that ABSA committed to do, for instance, was that we need to have a special land reform fund to be able to finance land reform. Because one of the big things that we set with is that government says land reform is a priority, but the budget that was actually allocated to land reform was not reflective of that commitment. And hence, the slow pace of transfer, never mind all the other squandering of the money that happened, but even the budget allocation itself to the process was inadequate for the process that it was committed to. So as commercial banks right now through BASA, we are sitting there trying to work out solutions with industry as well on how can we not only achieve the reform in terms of agrarian reform, but also how do we make that land work? Because as Wandile pointed out, that's the big challenges that we sit with. It's a sad state of affairs where you take land with registered rights and give it to somebody with totally unregistered rights. And you say that person must compete in the system against the existing system where people have registered rights. And even more challenging for the new owners of the land or users of the land is that up to 1996, South African agriculture industry was regulated. So you basically knew that if you produced cotton, there was the ginnery. If you produced maize, this is where you took it to. If you produced beef, there were your abattoirs. So, and prices were fixed and so on. So people worked in that system. Those who were entrepreneurs and could do well, did well. Those who were not doing so well sort of tagged along. Then come deregulation. The entrepreneurs do better. They climb up, they grow their businesses, they consolidate farms, they grow. Those who are not doing well fall by the wayside. Then you say to the likes of Gift, new generation farmer, no history of farming in their lifetime. I was just saying earlier on, maybe just to clarify the point. If you talk to your average commercial farmer, they will always say, I'm fourth generation farmer, fifth generation farmer, i.e. the grandparents bought the farm, paid off that debt, the father put on the assets, mechanization and so on, and now going forward, really, you're just using this asset now, it's fully paid for. The new generation farmers, the black farmers, come into the scenery. There's no information because it's all deregulated, it's highly competitive. You don't know what to do, there's no support, and you expect them to succeed in that. And moreover, they don't have the land rights as such. They don't have the tenure security, they don't have the registered rights against which they can borrow. So really, they were set up for failure, and that's why you would look at it and say land reform has failed. But I think for me, the transfer itself is necessary, and everybody agrees with that. Where we've really, really gone wrong is how we've done the transfer, given people unregistered rights and then inadequate support to carry on. Then maybe just to quickly rattle through what some of the solutions then that we're looking at. With the industry, we're working on an agri-development agency that looks at how do we finance these people that we say now they are unfinanceable. And a lot of it is even not considering the land as collateral, but you look at your value chains, off-take agreements, adequate support in terms of mentorship and so on, and then you're able to finance them going on. And that's part of the contribution to the solutions. And another thing that we've advocated for, we haven't done much about it, but I think we need to do something about it, is the mapping out of the land, or who owns who, how much of this land, because that's a big debate, and that's why we always say it hasn't worked. Nobody really has accurate figures. At some point we had 3 from research articles or research outputs saying how much, who owns what land, and they all spoke different numbers, and that caused a whole lot of confusion. So we need to do that. We need to have a proper land registry that says who has owned, who owns what, and then work from there. So then we can measure our pace of land reform, and all of us comfortably say that it's happening. Otherwise, right now, the have-nots feel that they really don't have. Those that have feel highly threatened, because how much is going to be taken away, that is not very clear in the policies. So policy certainty is one of the big requirements in land reform. I'll stop there.
Thanks to Gift. From the perspective of a practicing farmer.
Thank you very much. Well, for us, I will talk for myself as well as fellow farmers out there. I think the focus for us is to depoliticize the whole debate on land, because our interests are much more commercial than political.
Wishful thinking, my friend.
By so saying, I will be quoting from some of the case studies that would probably apply to me or any other beneficiary out there. Maybe just to give a small background on my position and to try and tie up what the two speakers has mentioned, is that I benefited in one of the programs called Proactive Land Acquisition Strategy, which Wandile alluded to, which basically means that you rent the farm from the government. They came up to try and upgrade the lease agreements from 5 years to 30-year lease with potential 20-year lease to extension. But the fact of the matter is, it remains a useless document. I am free to, if it's all allowed, I can share that document. It says nothing. You can't present it to any institution for any requirement that one may have. So what we are saying, we're saying, we know the systems that have worked in the past in terms of tenure systems. One would be your title deed system. And, well, long-term leases, which were also, I don't think they are registered with the deeds office. So for the lack of innovation in the whole discussion, it carries on to create challenges in future. So we are saying, let's come up with innovative solutions now that would look to bring solutions that will be sustainable and be relevant 50 years from now. One of the examples would be, there's so many lease agreements that have been handed out, but they are not working. The land is stagnant. Nothing is happening on those lands. But neither government or the bank or the beneficiary can do anything. Maybe the beneficiary can do something, but banks can't do anything. They've borrowed money to beneficiaries to do some business activities which has not materialized. And what happens is land becomes stagnant and beneficiaries can't pay back the loans. Banks loses big time, hence they have to enforce the security in terms of loans. But if that lease agreement is tradable, if deeds office would most probably be open enough and bring in another system of registering tenures and say long-term leases can be tradable, I would then be free to go to the bank and get a loan, and the bank would recognize that and look at my proposals and be able to finance that. What that has done, it has opened up a market. It hasn't put anyone on the risk because the owner remains the owner. In this instance, the government remains the owner until otherwise the policy changes. The beneficiary would then have to play his part or her part in terms of making sure that the business progresses or it becomes profitable and it can move forward and it's able to pay off its debt. If it happens that debts are not serviced, the bank can easily trade that long-term lease to someone else who may be eligible to take over the use of that land. So all we're saying is that land ownership is as much as important, but if systems, tenure systems are extended to allow for commercial transactions, it opens up the whole lot of opportunities for people who may not be willing to I'm not advocating for new farmers here, but for players who are already in the space, it opens up a lot of opportunities in terms of saying, I don't want to own land. It is too much of a risk. It is too much of a burden. But I would like to have access to that good land I see adjacent to what I have right now. I'm willing to put up my resources, raise resources, and go and work that land. So from us is we pushing the agenda from the commercial side and not necessarily from political side, because we as farmers are affiliated to people who can talk better on our needs in terms of policy, environment. But the industries, the different industries, I'm very much involved in the grain industry. We need to do work ourselves in terms of making sure that now the land has been, well, the land debate is going on, and we've got access to land in any form of tenure. What can we do? What can the industry do for us in terms of ensuring that development happens continuously? It doesn't stop, because what has happened after deregulation on the commercial side now is that there hasn't been the post-settlement support in terms of markets, structured finance for new farmers, and all the other systems that enables the farmer to be able to kickstart and sustain his business. Thank you.
And what if people like Sydney say that if you extend the 10-year arrangement from a longer term lease rather than a short term contract, that they want to price in greater risk and therefore higher interest rates for anything that you want from them?
Well, I think it's still happening. It is happening right now, where when you walk into a bank, you looked at what is your financial position. So I think it's already happening now. So it's their prerogative to say, well, we can accept that system on these conditions.
Sydney, from the land bank, why are you guys so nasty?
Yeah, it's always a bad position to be when you're the last one to comment after everybody else, because they pretty much have covered most of the elements. So I'll try and take a different tack. But before I do that, in response to the question you were raising with gift, when we do finance, and I'm sure Doc here will back me up, when you do finance a project of the nature that he's talking about, if there's a long-term lease, and therefore there's no need for the bank to finance that property, then the financing of that transaction or that project is more around the productive use of that land. And to that extent, then it becomes cheaper in terms of the new entrant in the market to operate on a leased basis, get experience, and once they have the markets and all of that with the history that they have to be successful, then they can procure land themselves. So I think the idea of a long lease arrangement should not be taken lightly. I think in the South African context, it's something that government should actually be looking at. You don't necessarily have to own land to utilize land. Now, back to perhaps some of the elements that I reckon need to be addressed, not because of a negative view around the agricultural sector and land in particular, is that even though the factual basis is not very clear, to the point that both my colleagues have made, we do all know historically that we legislatively excluded blacks from owning land in the past. And so whether we like it or not, whether we are disagreeable as to the extent of the audit, the challenge remains, and that's why the issue is so emotional. But we also need to look at this thing from a context point of view. So if you take South African land and the scarcity of arable land in South Africa, and perhaps Wandile can comment on that one. Our understanding is that there's about 13 to 14% of really arable land for crop production purposes. And a bigger portion is obviously from a livestock perspective. So you're sitting with the availability of land for agricultural purposes being a scarce resource. And if there's unused resources within the scarcity that we're talking about, it becomes even more problematic. And so to that extent, I mean, some people, taking into account the issues around audits, but there are estimates that are being made that between 1.6 to 1.8 million hectares of land, particularly in the areas like KZN, Eastern Cape, and Limpopo, are not fully utilized for agricultural purposes. So the issue of whether there's potential upside, indeed, if you were to utilize that land and bring more land into production, then there are opportunities for growth in the sector. Take into account the challenges that agriculture basically faces, not only in the form of the scarcity of land, but also in terms of climate, weather changes, the temperatures rising, as everybody understands and knows, and apparently estimate in the South African context whether those are correct or not, but reality is that global warming is in effect, and that over a century period, you're talking about an increase of 2% on average in temperatures. That's a challenge in as far as agriculture is concerned. South Africa is also a water scarce country. So that's another challenge. And the point that I'm trying to move to is to the extent to which it is important that this country gets it right. Because if there's scarcity in all of the issues that I'm talking about, and there's still elements of lack of policy certainty. And in fact, in some instances, good policy pronouncements are made. Some of them are not necessarily coherently complementary to each other, but there are some good ideas that are being thrown around. The challenge, and I think Wandile also spoke about it, is the issue of execution. So when you know there's a specific program that needs to be undertaken in terms of land redistribution, how well do you execute that particular policy and or program? And Wandile touched on it. If the selection of beneficiaries who are supposed to utilize that land is not appropriately undertaken, and therefore you have people that do not necessarily have the desire nor the passion to make these lands work to the extent that they should work, you will sit with a problem. If on the same wavelength, you do not have sufficient programs of support to make these beneficiaries successful, and Gift touched on it, you are again sitting with a problematic situation. So to the extent that we will take advantage of the opportunities that are there in the agricultural space, there's a need for appropriate execution of all the things that we all talk about, because in some instances we may disagree policy-wise, but even in that disagreement, if she went and executed on a disagreed policy and I went and executed and there's success in both areas, then you have at least something to build on. But if execution is not appropriately undertaken, you have issues. I'm not talking for the agricultural sector, but given the experiences that we have as the Land Bank in having worked with established commercial farmers and their attitude towards partnerships, we're beginning to see some of them taking heed of the challenges that we face as a country, and that you rather share than lose. And to that extent, we're seeing conversations happening with new entrants in the market, with partnerships being established. And the roles of institutions like ourselves is to promote that kind of transformation in the sector. And so to that extent, there are also opportunities from a positive perspective to utilize those opportunities for the upside in the agricultural space. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Dr. Simela, a quick question to you. Were you perhaps suggesting that there might be a need for a reintroduction of these agricultural marketing boards?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
What I was really saying was that with the deregulation, there was not enough support for new entrants. So they really entered into this world that was highly competitive, with high risks in terms of your climate, your water, and everything, and themselves not skilled enough to tackle it without adequate support. So no, I'm not suggesting that we need the marketing board, but we need proper support to the entrants in the market.
And that you don't think that would be one aspect of support to them?
No, we prefer an open market. We prefer a free market system. I think it's working quite well for us.
You don't have to say that because you're talking to bankers.
No,
It's fine if you...
And I'm saying that because I work for business, for banks, and I'm in the agribusiness chamber, so that's what works for us. I mean, once you start putting price controls, then you really interfere with the markets. Typically, look at our, was it the 2015-16 season?
Yeah.
Where we had really the lowest yields in terms of maize and so on. But what saved our clients was that they had good prices for that. So at the end of the day, the turnover wasn't that badly affected. But now, once you start coming in with boards, with price controls, I mean, we've seen it in our neighboring countries where your costs are way over your market price, and you just kill the industry. Nobody goes into production.
Okay, can I jump in on this?
Sure.
Because I think the issue, the benefit of the boards, which disadvantaged most of the black entrants who were coming in agriculture, was the support system.
Yeah.
Because if you look from the inception, 1912, if you look at what agricultural policies were in place and what were those boards doing, aside from the purchasing of guaranteeing the market, but there was also an agricultural credit board which was subsidizing and making sure that everyone benefit. But since then we've changed the regime, 1997, 1998 in terms of that, then that's where that fell off. And then now you tell a gift to compete with Kubas, who, you know. So all of that, I think that caused a bit of a problem.
But I think, if I may, the issue of market access for the success of new entrants, as my colleagues indicate, cannot be underestimated. So I think even though you might not want to interfere with the free market system, if one can call it that, but there needs to be some orchestrated market access opportunities that are made available for new entrants. And the state is one such organization that has the capacity to purchase that can be utilized appropriately to benefit new entrants. Others will talk about quality and so on. We can debate the issue. But the fact is that there has to be some form of orchestration. If that orchestration does not happen, then market access support is not necessarily promoted for these new entrants. The established farmers have access to demand across the world, not only in the South African context. So we cannot leave it to chance, but have some programs to support market access for new entrants.
Gift?
Yeah, I think from my side where I'm sitting is we cannot leave it to government. And I'm saying that from the view that the industry itself, as Wandile was saying, since way back, the industry has been gradually increasing or constantly increasing, very sustainably so, well funded by both government and by the industry itself. It's been developing at a acceptable rate, but eventually when deregulation happened, there's been lack of investments in farming or in agriculture. There's been lack of interest from government and even lack of understanding of the industries within the sector. So I'll make an example. If you go to a sugarcane industry, they are not regulated by Department of Agriculture. They are seen as an industry that can do much more, and it's regulated by DTI. And they've got massive collection of levies, which helps in developing the industry. And through changes that has happened in the recent past, we see black farmers starting to go back into planting small-scale sugarcane production, and we see government coming in and having that interest and shifting the focus into prioritizing production of sugarcane. And we see new entrants having a word through their platforms, as well as established commercial farmers having a word through their well-established platforms. And I see sugar industry or sugar cane farmers having much more prosperity than any other industry in terms of grain. Grain is a staple food of South Africa, but there hasn't been a move into making sure, or an appetite from a developed sector or developed players as well as government. So we are, for example, saying we should have a levy on maize in South Africa to help develop grain sector to where it should be. Because if you think of costs like your mechanization costs, you can have access to land. But if you can't do your plantings in a specific window period that is regarded as the best planting window period, you are automatically out of the game. Hence, it's critical to be able to assist from that angle and know what are the challenges, the bigger challenges, rather than individual challenges as you go from farm to farm.
If you want to add before I open up to the floor.
He said there's policy uncertainty. There's no policy. He said there's policy uncertainty. There's no policy uncertainty now. Okay, it is there, but not as intense. I do think, though, that we've highlighted all of the challenges and all things that have been happening. But if you look at the trajectory of saying, is there a clear framework of where the country, in terms of land reform, put away agriculture, but just broadly on its importance for the country? Is there a clear framework of where we're going? And what will be that route look like? Is that something that poses threat to the economy on the Republic at large? And I think at this point, at least, there's beginning to be a clear process. You look in some of the broader terms of reference at which, for example, the president has set out, look at the advisory panel that were part of it, of saying what were the terms of reference and what needs to come out of that particular one. The message that is beginning to come out is cognizant of the issue of investments. And we believe that we can be able to make land reform across spectrum happen without necessarily going in a broader, widespread expropriation or whatever way that you talk about. How will that land reform be available? The land reform fund that Dr. Smela talked about, at the presidency side, there might be an angle which might come up advising or saying there might be a structuring of a land reform fund to purchase some of the other land. Seed capital for that potential fund, there's a clear framework now on how that will come about. There's already what Sydney referred to, a willingness from private sector to avail some of the land, mining groups, some of the agribusinesses and churches on land donation, and that could assist both on the urban area side where we see the demand being strong, as well as on the farming side on adding on availability of land. But also going back to those pieces of land that Gift also referred to, of saying we have pieces of land that is actually not having any title deeds, and how do we ensure that comes into full production? If you put all of those clusters together, the fund, the one that you buy through the fund, and also provide assistance on making it productive, you take what the government already owns, you take what comes on donations, you can make some bit of progress on easing up the pressure that does exist. But I do think also the good focus needs to be on the urban land side. But as far as the process is concerned, I think that today you should be at a much more easier way of looking at this in terms of cautiousness than you were, say, a year ago, where there were no clear framework of what is going on. And the last point, even if you were to look at the ANC implementation of its policy side, of its policy cycle from 1994 to today, there hasn't been a case where they implement something that is not in the resolution of their conference. And again, if you were to go and read the resolution of the conference, not to listen at all what they go and saying on rallies, there's not much of the hardcore thing that I think it will be a threat to undermine the economy on the Republic as far as large. I think we are at least at a much more better place today.
Do you want to respond, or can I just pose? I have a serious question.
No, carry
but
on.
it's fine. No. Say what you.
Mine was a follow-up on gift. I think he gave a good example on market access. And I want to say one thing that we do in South Africa is we set up these good policies but never really sort of make sure they work. In terms of market access and working with the industry, I mean, we have the BEE policy in this country. And if you look at your enterprise and supplier development component just out of that policy, there's a massive contribution that private sector can make to finance the developing sector. And right now what we're all looking at is the motor industry has done it. You know, they've localized a whole lot of parts production in the country based on that supplier development principle. So that's what now agriculture is also looking into implementing, working with established industry to develop the developing farmers and link them to the existing industry because it's there, you know, so that they have the access to the markets. But also what then we also seek for that is open to trade, to access to export markets, because we're second largest exporter of citrus. We're very big in macadamia, avocados. Those are our large export earners. But I don't think we've played enough a role to make sure that we have access to the markets compared, for instance, to our South American counterparts. So there's lots and lots of room for development. And to Wandile's point, all these issues have been brought up. There's a public partnership growth initiative in the presidency where Agribusiness Chamber is part of it, and some of your major commodity associations to drive that initiative to say, how do we drive the similar levels of growth that we saw in the motor industry with government partnering with industry?
It reminds me of something a panelist said this morning. It was the economist Lumkile Mondi on the macro implementation panel. When you spoke about BEE, it reminded me of this point in this article I also saw in this week's Mail and Guardian. I don't know if any of you saw it. Isn't this kind of, it's not contradictory, but isn't this kind of web of policy on land reform partly something which satisfies the craven needs of a political class, not just in rhetoric, but in active corruption? So I don't know if you saw this week's Mail and Guardian, in which connected people in the political class are exploiting the whole reform and redistribution agenda to themselves colonize pieces of land. And Lumkile this morning was making a very similar point, that BEE has been used and abused not for development and redistribution, but by a craven political class. I mean, I don't know if you have a view on that.
I think it talks to a lack of interest. Lack of interest for development, for transformation, economic transformation. Look, we've got a certain size of economy, and there's players within that economy. It's only government that can drive that process through the policy. But obviously, there is a lot of gaps, but there's lack of leadership, if I can put it that way. There's just simply lack of leadership. There is no follow through on any program of government. There isn't follow through, especially on sectors that are under prioritized, like agriculture. You can name some of them.
Yeah. I think I would like to make the point I mentioned earlier, the issue of execution. So if we get that right, and the execution is underpinned by appropriate objectives, and there's sufficient ethics and governance around it, that should not happen. So I think we can lament the fact that perhaps in some instances politically influential individuals have taken advantage of that, but they take advantage of that because the execution mechanism is not sufficiently robust to avoid such. Because if you've put sufficient prescriptions on what kinds of beneficiaries should have access to these pieces of land, and it's appropriately executed, you should not have those issues. So for me, it comes back again to the issue of execution. No country will ever claim to have no people that carries self-interest. There isn't, and so is the balances of those self-interests against the interest of appropriate governance and appropriate selection that I think is more important.
I'm glad you mentioned that then, because in the writing of the policy, we've drafted the beneficiary selection criteria for redistribution on what it will be, and you will see. And in terms of execution, we've opened a room on how private sector will assist because of the know-how that they have, while there will be that fund to anchor that. So.
Hi, it's a pretty broad question. I just want to go back to the skills and the learning and the base. I mean, it sounds like you're implying that potentially building block number one of becoming a successful farmer might potentially not be there. I mean, are the numbers of BE farmers coming through the agricultural colleges and the mentorship programs and things like that, is the skills base there? And then my second question is more around scale. You know, you mentioned how climates are changing, and from what I've seen, the only way that people can compete are just by getting bigger. So this underutilized land that we're talking about, from a land bank perspective, maybe, I mean, are you giving parcels of land out that are of big enough scale to give a farmer that's got a good enough skills base to be able to make a success of it?
Further questions?
I think, to me, the colleges are not doing what they should be doing. They're focusing on graduates and churning out youth, which I feel is probably not the right way to do it. Or if you're going to do it, then make them practical. Don't compete with universities, because then you just have a whole pool of unemployed people who know the theory and have no practical experience. But the commodity associations like Grain SA, Potato SA, the fruit industry, name it, they really have good, strong mentorship programs going on to help the developing farmers, you know, to acquire the right set of skills and grow. And I will say that us as a commercial bank, we're trying to build more reliance on that kind of support, you know, as a risk mitigant, you know, to make sure that they have a mentor who's got an agenda to say you support this person from point A to point B to the end of the process. And then based on that and other forms of support, we can finance. So there's a lot of that going on. Scale is still a problem. But then again, the cost structure is very different in those farms. They don't have a massive, huge overhead costs usually. It's mainly just the farm and the cost of production. So the cost structure is a bit different. And my opinion of it is we have this pool of smallholder farmers. We cannot neglect them. They're sitting on an asset, which is land in South Africa. Let's use it as productively as possible. To give the Grain SA example again, is that they have supported your smallholder farmers now. I'm talking about 1 hectare, 5 hectare on communal land, basically first to produce enough for the household, and then it goes over. I mean, somebody now has 7 tons per hectare, which is way more than they need. And then now there's a need to build the infrastructure to bring the excess grain into the market. So my perception is that let's start there. And then scale will be built over years. For instance, even with your plus farms, or the ones that have 100 hectares, 200 hectares of grain, they will start there, they will earn some income. Some of them will want to expand, some of them will want to migrate to other sectors. So the ones that expand are buying out the farms around them, which is exactly what happened, by the way, post-deregulation. I mean, everybody had a certain size, farm size, and then as the others fell off, the ones that existed bought in the farms and took over. So my point really is, let's start with what we have and make it productive. If it remains unproductive, then we won't move. But if there's production, then at least we create a pathway for scaling up.
Yeah, so maybe just to add, I'm not going to touch on the skills. I think the doc has covered it very well. Technically, we're not training sufficient people that can get onto the field and work. It's more theorists at this stage, but so there's a lot to be done there. And on the scale side, I agree with the posture taken, but also to add that the choice of crop is also important. Yes. Because scale can only work in as far as the nature of the crop is concerned. But if you go into producing high value products like strawberry, mushrooms and the like, yes, scale can count, but the nature of the crop lends itself to smaller operations. And then on the issue that you raised around unutilized land, we haven't seen much of that, but where we have seen it, we've seen it work. In the Eastern Cape, we have funded a macadamia operation where previously that land was not utilized for that purpose. And it is starting to bear fruit with the community there, well organized into a structure, corporate structure, with broad-basedness that it supports the communities. And we have seen good crop coming out of the finances that we've undertaken in what was previously unutilized land. So there are examples of that nature where unutilized land can be brought to production.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So just given the challenges that we've identified around agriculture and things like being water constrained as a country, just maybe what are your thoughts around things like the technology or the things that you're seeing overseas, like hydroponics and things like that, as practical solutions to solve some of these problems? So almost to leapfrog wherever we are now to kind of get to something which is maybe a bit more productive or more progressive in the space.
Absolutely essential, I would say. We are a water scarce country, and I think it's going to get even harder on us. So we need to look into those water-saving technologies. And there's a lot of initiatives going on. I mean, at this level, there's already discussion with people that can provide those technologies, in partnership with IFC, on how can we bring those technologies into the South African agri-industry. And there was already a demonstration that some other industries are doing it. I always say I'm pretty fascinated by Israel, because it's a very dry country, but they yield like 23 tons of maize per hectare compared to what's our highest on dry land, well, even irrigated, 15, or I don't know. Yeah. So we need to get to that point where we use our water as efficiently as possible. And even ourselves as commercial banks, we're really getting into that conversation of what is out there that our clients can use and how can we promote it in the industry. You even find your financing agencies, for instance, your international financing agencies would also come up with packages and say, to try and assist the commercial banks to lend for energy saving, reduction of carbon emissions, efficiency in water usage. So yeah, I think going forward we'll see much more of that coming into the industry. We can't avoid that.
Yeah. I just want to add that, just to be on a scientific side, on grains to be specific, because the question is so relevant that it differs from crop to crop. So on grains, we know that the Agricultural Research Council has developed a cultivar, a maize cultivar that is resilient and it is drought resistant. I have not done trials myself, but that cultivar was developed in partnership with other research institutions across Africa. So by so saying is that it is us who would need then to help in commercializing such technologies or such work, because you get a commercial industry that is largely owned by Americans, and they will do anything to suppress whatever that we try on our own. They will even buy some of our own, and our government will not be interested in protecting us. So not to dive into politics, but there is means to mitigate climate change. There is means, and I think the country with imported skills as well as skills from home, within the grain sector, there's still a lot of hope, and there's still a lot of potential innovations that can help, especially poor resourced farmers or the new entrants into farming. So as developing farmers, we are now organizing ourselves and saying we want to support Agricultural Research Council. We want to support land bank. When someone tells us that land bank is bad in this way, we want to say, no, wait a minute, let's have a meeting with land bank and say, this is how we would want to utilize the smallest resource, the smallest land that we have to produce optimally. Because for us, it's not about scale. You would develop to such a point where you are stretched on many needs, especially equipment, because commercial agriculture requires equipment. Even the small scale production requires some form of equipment. Now, where should the focus be? On being able to produce more on little land that you have. So your international supply is more focused on scaling up and on horizontally and make more food to sell or available. So there is a lot of innovations, but it's us who need to take that up and bring it to a commercial level. It would be difficult because of politics of business.
Any further questions? No? So Gift, basically you're saying things are okay, we just need a better class of politician. We need more prudent politicians.
I'm saying things are okay, we need better farmers.
Not better politicians.
No.
So we can live with worse politicians.
I don't think we can rely on them.
Any last closing remarks before I close the panel? So.
No, I was just saying, I think from what I've seen, there's a lot of positivity in the sector. We had this nation in conversation at the NAMPO, the agricultural park, and you could really feel the vibrancy and positivity in the sector. I think what we need to focus a whole lot more is the partnership to support development and make it happen. I think for the longest time, we've really functioned in silos as a country. Government is government, it does its own thing. Banks are banks that do their own thing. Farmer organizations are farmer organizations that do, and it hasn't succeeded. So I think now we're talking about those smart partnerships, progressive partnerships, whatever you call them, and it's time to build on them. And I think we have the hope. We have, to me, I see a bright future for the South African agricultural sector.
Right, I can only echo that. But just to also say that I think it's not either or this group or that group. I think it's everybody must do their best, so including the politicians. So the politicians also have a role to play. And the reason why I say this is that when you establish, because they drive policy, and when you establish particular policy stances, and you create specific institutions to deliver on that, you have to make sure that they are appropriately capacitated to do their work. Because the idea merely of establishing an institution and then you are not appropriately capacitating it is not useful. And so to the extent that when you establish an agency, you were talking about one deal, and even in terms of the land bank itself, the extent to which you expect its mandate to be appropriately delivered, the capacitation thereof, the capitalization of that institution, because currently it just raises funds from the commercial markets. And so the risks are similar to what any commercial bank would need to undertake in order to repay all of the investors that are looking for high returns in investing with us. So to the extent that you have these entities, we've seen it with ESCOM and others, you need to appropriately capacitate, and that's where the politicians are very important. Granted, everybody else has to play their part. And as I indicated, there are opportunities for an upside in agriculture, and I'm as confident as the doctor here.
Right. From my side, I would echo the same sentiments as my colleagues, but I would also have, I would like you to think of the possibility, particularly back again on a land policy outside of agriculture, that there is a probability that you might not see an amendment in the Constitution. The ANC, if you read their documents, they want to change the Constitution for expropriation in particular pockets of land. The economic freedom fighters want overall expropriation. ANC has 57.5% of the vote. The economic freedom fighters have 10.5 or something like that. The Democratic Alliance has just over 20%. ANC on themselves, while they are a majority on the people that are currently reviewing the text on what should the amendment be on the Constitution, which you will all know by end of June, when they come up with that stance, if the EFF feels that it is too market friendly or it's not in line with their view, what if they don't vote for that? And the DA has made their points clear that they're not going to vote for a change in the Constitution. And the ANC themselves, they don't have the 66% numbers to make that change. So there is a probability that you might not see the change in the Constitution, but the expropriation bill, which is already out, which we believe that it is in line with the Constitution, you can go for those pockets of land that have been identified, might be one of the tools that would actually be used. So broader economic side, that is of the risk that other people are thinking about, that they might not actually be there. But social side, that is not going to take away the fact that there are people who feel outside of the economy, and also some restorative justice issues that we need to deal with as a country, and which is where then all of these plans of partnership and agriculture and urban development and all of those things needs to filter through in the system. And I think that's one of the possibilities that you also have to think about. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So we've almost come to the end of the day. There are two small things that need to happen. I will provide a very quick roundup, not of what the excellent speakers have said throughout the day, but just a perspective framing. And then Fawzia will close. So I'll call Fawzia up once I'm quickly done, and I should be done very soon. So, from what we've heard from the morning, we're not entirely certain about what is going to happen in the ANC. Wandile, you're very confident about their 57%, but there's a reality that a slice of them might combine with a slice of the EFF on particular issues, considering that they have similar interests. Some of them simply need to stay out of jail, even though if it might not be an overlapping political interest or policy interest, there's other mercurial and other interests which drive them. So we don't know what that looks like, and we don't know whether there is going to be a great degree of policy consistency or whether there might in fact be a little bit of paranoia. Of course, Mr. Vali Musa believes that the president's very confident, will be able to go ahead and do what he needs to do, but it's anyone's guess. When we heard the macro panel, everything wasn't terribly clear or convincing, one way or the other. If you think about the opposition, Well, you've got a major opposition party which is in a bit of crisis. It has a major identity crisis, doesn't quite know who it is, what it stands for, whether it's an alternative ANC or an alternative to the ANC. So they've got a policy crisis, they've got an ideological crisis, they've got an identity crisis, and their caucus has been reduced to a similar extent that the ANC's caucus has been reduced. And then you've got a resurgent EFF, which has increased its support. Now, in some ways, that means it might be better for oversight, and you might have better institutional operation because the ANC has to streamline its limited or its reduced majority